Hello, Cadre 3. This is one of the videos. We're going to give an attempt to try this. I think we've got some of the technical issues worked out, so get this loaded on Blackboard. This video is related to a PowerPoint that's also loaded on Blackboard, and I still can't figure out how to get them both loaded at the same time. So if you can split your screen and watch that while we go along, that would be helpful because I'm going to be talking from that PowerPoint. Strategies for teamwork and collaboration is what this is all about. And while we're not talking about specific step-by-step kinds of things for you to do, we're talking about the strategies at a conceptual level. And we'll show you some examples of what those kind of things look like, so you have a mental model of what we're talking about when we talk about the strategies. Well, there are many strategies. I mean, we could have YouTube videos from now until a year from now and not cover all the different strategies, specific strategies that are out there. But they fall into four categories that have a conceptual model that identifies kind of what they're all about. And those four categories are braiding, blending, networks, and webs. And so we're going to talk about each one of those, again, as a mental model or conceptual model, and show you an example of what they might be, what they might look like in kind of real life, so to speak, or in an application. All right, the first one is braiding, and probably the best example would be like braids of hair, ropes, that kind of thing, where different strands are wound around each other. And you know, the more strands you wind around, the more usually exotic the thing is, whether it's hair or rope or whatever it might happen to be. Anyway, it's this twisting around and around of different strands and so forth. And a good example is the three-ply rope, which is usually the standard for most ropes, although many of them are even have more strands than that. But let's apply that three strands or four strands kind of notion to a braided rope. And let's say what you're trying to do is basically braid in the things that you need to do in order to implement the Common Core standards. Certainly you need curriculum instructional materials, certainly you're going to need a data system, and certainly you're going to need professional learning, just to mention three. And then you begin to wrap all of those around the Common Core standards, and you begin to get a set of strategies about how, as a team, you're going to work in the implementation of the Common Core state standards. And I think that's a good visual to use, and it's one of those that's on the PowerPoint. When you have a braided rope, there's a phenomenon that happens with the braiding process itself, in that the braided rope is stronger than any one of the single braids that are part of it. The same is true with hair. There's examples of people, you know, that are not the lightest people in the world, having their hair braided and hanging from a hook in the sky. They certainly wouldn't do that with a few strands of hair, but you begin to braid major clumps of hair around, and it becomes very strong, in fact, to the point where your scalp can stand that kind of thing. I never tried it, but and I wouldn't recommend doing that. It's not a requirement for this course to try that. Anyway, it's stronger than any one of the braids by itself. It might be more appealing as a strategy because in the case of like different colors of rope, you can come up with quite a exotic and beautiful design as a result of having, say, red, white, and blue, or a variety of rainbow kind of colors that are blending together in this rope. But the point of it is that, well, the application to people is that with the number of people that are coming together around this braiding process, you can get a considerable and complementary kinds of folks working together to form a relationship with each other that by themselves they would not be able to do. It's the mix of the braids that make the rope, not the braids themselves, and I think that's the point about teamwork and collaboration. The next category of strategies is called blending, and think about it in the sense of cans of paint being poured onto a table or in another container, and up to 3 or 4 or 5, whatever you want to imagine, that as you then pour them together, the colors start to mix, and then you can't really see any one of the colors anymore, and they come up with something kind of wholly new. And if you apply that to, let's say, a larger picture called you want successful student outcomes. Those pigments or colors might include assessments or school improvement or data systems, professional learning. The Common Core standards could be curriculum instructional materials, communication, formative assessment, on and on and on. So you begin to blend all this together in order to achieve the outcome of successful student learning outcomes. And so these things you're putting together create a whole new set of outcomes that no one of them could do by themselves. In other words, just putting in assessments, and I don't care how good they are not necessarily going to improve student outcomes. Neither is the designing and putting in a data system. That's not going to change student outcomes. It'll help measure them, I suppose. Transition plans, on and on and on. Anyway, the point of it is no one of them is going to do it. Neither is any two of them. It's the blending that creates the strength in terms of whole new fabric, whole new color, whole new way of doing things. In blending, the various pigments create a whole new color, and it's usually not related to any one of the colors that's there. The new color might be somewhere in the range of a dominant color because, say, several of the pigments you put together are red, orange, that kind of range, and so there's more of a reddish orange or pink to it kind of thing. But usually if those things are all poured in there, the new color doesn't reflect any of the colors that went into it. And I think that's the whole thing, is that you want to create something new. You want to focus on student outcomes and be successful with it. Therefore, blending all that stuff together makes sense. The next category are networks, and visualize this as a central circle, circles around the outside of it, all connected to the middle. It'd be kind of like the computers in a computer lab. They're all connected to a central server. There's a local area network or large area network that's connecting them. And basically, in the concept of a network, they're connected to the center, which can be a good strategy for teamwork, depending on what it is that you're trying to do. For example, if you're trying to create one piece of any of those other two models, such as you're trying to identify the process of school improvement, you might put school improvement in that center circle and then put all the components of school improvement around it. The point of it is they all feed into that center, but they're not necessarily those individual components connected to each other. It'd be just like in a lab, in a computer lab, the computers can speak to the central server, can send information to it, but can't go from one computer to another without going through that central server. And usually the pieces around that network are, probably not always, but in many cases, each of those pieces are identical. In other words, it's an identical computer that's sitting on every table that's there, although I guess that wouldn't necessarily have to be the case. The fourth and final category are webs. I think the key thing about webs is they're a social network to begin with. And so the web is something that is there naturally because people are together socially, whether it's a faculty that does a lot of things that are outside the classroom, particularly in their meetings. They do a lot of professional learning community things. They may even do fun things outside of the school time. But there's a social network that already exists there, of which the strategy becomes a part of. And like the network, the various parts of it are connected to a center, but then each part is connected to each other part. And then there's this part in the center that radiates out toward the outer parts, but then there's gradations in the connections between the various pieces. Just like in a spider web, there's a set of concentric circles that keep getting larger and larger, connecting all the pieces or strands of the web to each other. One of the I think most interesting ways of using the concept of a web is in the drawing that's in the PowerPoint right after the spider web, which is a drawing that's trying to show a multitude of stuff and how it's all connected. And actually, this came from the strategic plan work that Doane College is doing, and the participants in the strategic planning process were just overwhelmed by the fact that in this 5-year plan there were 90, 110 items, and trying to identify what's more important, trying to identify what's connected to what, became a really difficult thing. In fact, folks were losing interest in the whole thing because it just looked way too complicated, and people would say, there's just too many things, I can't deal with all this. So created this drawing that basically shows there are 5 key themes in this plan, and then the things that are connected to those 5 key things, and particularly if there's an order to them, you can begin to stage them out just like limbs on a tree kind of thing, to show, all right, this item A has to happen before B, has to happen before C, and so forth. And it's a good, clean way to show if there are, again, 5 or 4, or whatever it might happen to be, major themes, major initiatives, of which there are smaller parts. You can begin to see how you could flesh that out into continually branching kinds of ways. In the case of the web, everything's connected to that center, and that's the whole point of it. Like in the case of Doane College, it's connected to its vision and set of core values. That's described in documents you may have seen called Live Doane. And so they're connected to that center, but then everything's connected to everything else, which is a more intense systems kind of approach, because the point being is that you start to connect anyone or change any one of those branches that come off that central core, you're going to affect everything else in the system, and that is as systems are supposed to be. Well, here's the question. You've all dealt with adaptive kind of issues. Adaptive meaning they've got to be adapted to the context, the culture, the capacity, and the setting in which this thing that you've created or are implementing is supposed to take place. And when you do that, the 4 strategies that you can use are braiding, blending, networks, and webs. And you'll find that, or you have found perhaps, that some of those things work better than others depending upon what it is you're trying to do and where you're trying to do it and what's the capacity of the group or the place in which this is being implemented. Because some of them have strengths and of course they all have things that they can't do very well. In many cases, I'll give you an example. I can recall doing some things that were quite new to that system and new to that faculty. I mean, they were out there in the professional practice, in the professional journal, but nobody in that faculty had really done anything with them. And so starting out with blending would have been a serious mistake, because I think what most people were afraid of is losing their identity or losing their sense of control of this environment. And so we began with, and I didn't know what to call it at that time, but it was a braiding strategy. We were putting special education and Title I and early childhood and all that kind of stuff. We were trying to braid that together into a coherent program, basically for preschool through grade 3 kind of things. And had we started with blending, I think we'd have been dead before we ever started the whole thing. However, as we learned to be comfortable with the braiding, where we could still see our identity, but yet we could see the strengthening of the system, it evolved naturally and kind of morphed into more of a blending strategy. And then network tend to evolve from that, and a combination of those 3, that was pretty powerful. And at one point then, it was just everything was connected to everything else, and we were off and running. It became the new culture of how we did things and so forth. But it would have been easy to blow that up from the very beginning by trying to start with a strategy for teamwork and collaboration that folks were not ready to do. So when you think about it, think about which ones might fit best, what are the pros and cons of them, which ones work best, and what kind of circumstances. And if you're dealing with an issue now, which ones might you use, which ones might you start with, and so forth. Well, that's the end of this video. There are others that you'll need to watch, but look forward to seeing you at our June session. Thank you.